Howdy. So I'm not going to get into extensive personal introductions because I'm assuming all of you were in the main stage for the show this morning. So we're delighted, though, to have more time with Toby Kiers, who just had to do a very short introduction for Merlin today. So Toby, as you may have seen from the slide behind her on the stage, is the executive director and the chief scientist at SPUN, the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks, which is going to be a lot of what we're discussing today. And Merlin is affiliated with SPUN and is, of course, the brilliant author of Entangled Life and is a doctorate in tropical, what is it?
Confusion.
Tropical confusion, right. Okay, so I think that what we're going to begin with is, because we got an overview this morning about the work that SPUN is doing, that to get a little more granular, because it's rather extraordinary the extent of the research that's going on in Africa, South America. There's so many projects that I was looking on the website and I was kind of blown away how you could you'd need a map of the projects, let alone a map of the mycelia. So why don't we start, Toby, with you to describe a little bit of the extent of what what SPUN is doing and how you're managing to organize that.
Great, so nice to see everybody. So SPUN is, it's about 2 years old, and it was founded by a need to really draw attention to underground ecosystems. Underground ecosystems are incredibly important across the earth, and they have been ignored in biodiversity and climate agendas. And so we wanted to activate a network of caregivers and scientists and researchers and local communities to start paying attention to underground ecosystems. And so that is what was birthed into the world. And now one of the main things that we do is we give small grants to a group of people called underground explorers that are interested in mapping fungal networks around where they live. And everybody has such different projects. And so wherever we go, we're working with local scientists and local collaborators to shine a light on ecosystems that people haven't been paying attention to. And so, for example, just last month, I was in Ghana, and Ghana is an amazing country. The southern coast is, from our predictive maps, it looks like one of the most biodiverse mycorrhizal spots on Earth. And sea levels are rising really fast in Ghana. And so what worries us is that a lot of these fungal communities might actually be washed away into the ocean. And so it feels really urgent. And when we go, we always work with local scientists, usually at the universities, to go on these expeditions where we use our predictive maps to go to particular places, particular pixels of Earth. Like, we see the world in this very pixelated view, and go to places that are predicted biodiversity hotspots, and then actually sample the soil and extract the fungal DNA and then feed that back into the pipeline. And what was interesting about this past work in Ghana, we were along the coast, we were in rainforests, was that after all of the expedition, we went to Kumasi, which is a bit further north, and we worked with 12 early career scientists from all across Africa to try to sequence the fungal DNA in the field. So there's new technologies that are emerging, which means that we don't have to send all this biological material off to expensive sequencers in the global north, but we could try to understand those communities right there in that community. So that's one of the projects that just happened last month. Yeah.
But just to add that, so there's some projects like that, some trips like that, I mean, Toby was on that trip, and there was a lot of organizing to gather these folks for this workshop and to do these new experiments in field sequencing. But a lot of these underground explorers, no one from SPUN goes there. It's like it's funding these local researchers to do the work and to become part of this larger community of of researchers. And it's amazing, the conversations that are starting between these different people in different parts of the world about how they've been doing it, what kind of questions they're answering. It's really becoming a scene, and it feels amazing to see.
And as part of the work then to collate all the information from all these places in your sort of central headquarters in Amsterdam and to do the mapping there and then to distribute that information, how does that work?
That's the most beautiful part about it is that the information is really context dependent. And so we work with this local scientists to create high-resolution maps in those countries, and then they use that for their own research. So they can, for example, compare agricultural lands to natural lands, or they can compare high mountaintops to low valleys. And so all of the questions that they have, that's where the data really comes into play. And then, based on that, they then share the data with us, and then that gets fed into an algorithm, which then we share with everybody. So really, I think the primary focus in these areas is to answer the local questions, but as we answer those local questions, we're building a larger map.
And then I had one question. The map that you showed earlier this morning had some of the most fungally biodiverse areas seem to be in Russia and Central Asia, and but most of the projects that I saw that SPUN is doing seem to be in Africa and tropical places. I mean, are there socio-political problems with having access to those regions? Yeah, what's the situation with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, those are some of the issues, but it's also a band across the whole sort of boreal region, right? So there are places to do sampling in boreal forest that are not in geopolitically complex zones. But also, we have a team went to Kazakhstan recently to sample in old-growth grasslands there. We're going to Mongolia in June to set up a lab to help build capacity so local researchers can do this DNA extraction work there. And so there are ways to work around, yeah.
And I think also one very important point about these maps is that there's two, as Merlin described this morning, there's two major categories of mycorrhizal fungi, and one is ectomycorrhizae and one is arbuscular. And the map that was shown this morning is the ecto, and those are associated with trees, and especially in the boreal forest, that's really where there's hot spots. But for example, in Ghana, that's the arbuscular mycorrhizal biodiversity hotspot. So there's different maps for different kinds of biodiversity. So it's not like there's just one map with, and that's where the highlighted areas are biodiverse. We have to think about them in different ways.
And so another question I have is that because SPUN is the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks, so part of this is the research to find out what you're protecting. But what is the political what are the political implications? Because if one is trying to protect lands, there's a whole conservation movement has been around a long time. But how might you organize specifically, and what kind of political institutions or movements would you have to build to actually protect, fungally biodiverse areas?
Yes, so there's, whenever a data set influences a decision, that's a kind of impact. And so we're thinking about the different theaters in which these data sets can influence decision makers. And some of that might look like the UN Biodiversity Lab with big maps, and they have data layers showing different aspects of biodiversity, and we could just provide a layer that would fit into a framework, and that would be one straightforward way to go. There might be more complex ways where we look for opportunities to use these data sets in environmental litigation. So government has licensed corporation to extract and destroy this ecosystem. Environmental lawsuits are taken out against the corporation and government. Those lawsuits need data sets and arguments, and SPUN data could come in there and potentially, and we're working on this with our collaborators who are at Bioneers, to help empower these environmental litigation cases. So that would be a way of seeing them enable existing campaigns to give a new dimension to the ecosystem that's being discussed. But then there might also be situations where, like the project with the Sariaku people, which we're so excited about, where the Sariaku have a vision of the living forest, Kausak Sacha, an interconnected whole, an animistic interconnected whole of the living forest. And they reached out to us and said, look, we see these fungal networks that you're describing living in intimate reciprocal dependence with the plants. We see these as really illustrating this point. And would you help us by coming to map these areas with us and provide these sets for us to be able to go to the government and say, look, these mining companies that left tons and tons of dynamite buried in our territories, this dynamite needs to go. You have a legal obligation to, because we won this case. They won this case. They're saying, we won this case. You need to get this dynamite out, and we can now show you quite exactly what is at stake, because we can say who is living underground, whereas before we couldn't. So these are some of the theaters of impact that we're experimenting with and we're exploring.
Yeah, and even to add to that a bit more, there are all of these local context, again, matters so much. So one of the projects that we were doing, one of the first ones in Chile, was sampling fungi under, if arguably, the oldest tree on Earth. And it's been the ponderosa pine, but now there's controversy that it might be the alerce, the bristlecone in California, but now it may be in Chile. And we got to go there and sample under this magnificent tree that may be 5,000 years old, 4,000 to 5,000 years old, right? But people hadn't looked at the fungal communities that are associated with these trees, right? And they grow so slowly, they call them slow growth rainforests. And they accumulate carbon on a scale of millennia. And these data sets, at this point, people understand how important this tree is. But as soon as we went there and we said there's a whole nother dimension underground, it started getting even more attention, right? So it's bringing attention to things that just haven't been getting enough attention. And so by going there and sampling the fungi, you add this different layer that helps protect that whole forest.
What did you find?
Ha! Just you wait. It's the best part of science. You have to be. But it was beautiful. We had to take off our shoes to sample, which is a really nice thing. Any excuse to take off shoes, I think, is welcomed. It was great.
Yeah, there are a lot of course, powerful metaphors about the underground, which we can get into a little bit later. But one other domain that's I'm interested in is you're talking about a lot about working locally, and a lot of this stuff is a bit like mushrooms popping out of the earth, that all these different people are getting in touch with you. But I see on your website that you have some very detailed and strict ethical guidelines about working with people all over the world. And I saw under this acronym MAPA, the most affected people in areas. So could you talk a little bit about that? Because it seemed very, given that you've only been around 2 years, that you are so solidly anchored in ethics seemed like a very positive thing to me. So.
Do you want to go ahead?
Well, map making has a history, and the history of map making is associated with a lot of colonial power. And those maps have been used to enable horrifying violence and horrifying ecocidal extraction. So when we're making maps, we have to be extremely careful about how that's happening, with whom are we making these maps, how is this data structure, what are the frameworks that this data lives within, how can we think about new ways for the data frameworks to work? For example, we're doing a project with the Sariaku as part of this, with our colleagues at NYU and the More Than Human Rights Collective to try and find ways that in Ecuador there's a rights of nature part of the Constitution, and that's been enforced in legal decisions. And so is it possible, for example, to create a data framework where the data that's collected actually belongs to the place itself? And administered by the Sariaku, and this would be a wild experiment, and who knows how this will work, but this is one way that we're starting to think about it. So, yeah, Toby.
Yeah, no, yeah. Keep going. It's incredible to, we're working with local scientists all over the world, and I think, my PhD is from Davis, right? It's just incredible, like the amount of resources that I had available to me as a scientist is just incredible. And then, when we were in Ghana, we're trying to do this technique with sequencing, and the power cuts right in the middle of the sequencing run. It's just a different. There's so much capacity that needs to be built in the global South for these scientists. It's emotional, because there is such great minds. There are so many amazing scientists that aren't getting the resources that they need. And they're just not part of the network that has been emerging. And so how do we foster that? And it's a big question. How do we foster all of these scientists that are so eager and have this way of wanting to experiment, wanting to explore these ecosystems, but not having the resources to do it? And so I think if that's the one thing that we can do is sort of shine light on that, bring resources, and allow them to ask the questions that they should be asking. I think it's really, really important.
So another thing that really shocked me in what you said this morning was you said that by the year 2050, I think that 90% of the most vital, fungal habitats could be destroyed. And I was thinking, given how important and fundamental these are to the entire web of life, what are the implications of that? If your work doesn't succeed to the scale that it needs to, what kind of unraveling of the biosphere would that entail?
So that was a UN prediction about soils in general. So 90% of soils degraded by 2050, and we're not the only people working on soils, thank goodness.
Thank goodness.
So if our work doesn't succeed, then maybe many, many of the other astonishing actors and coalitions who are working to conserve and protect soils will succeed. And to add that. But the consequences are fairly unimaginable. I mean, a soil is the site and the hotbed and the cradle and crucible of so much of life and so many of the vital processes that it's an organ of the planet. And so, yeah, I could give you a litany of disasters, but I probably don't need to spell it out. Yeah.
But the life in the soil, I think, is also something that we don't think about. We really think of it as sort of a chemical and physical structure. That there's just so much life, and being able to quantify and characterize and explore that life, I think, is gaining more traction now. Because I think that's what's unimaginable for me, is like, there's all these creatures that have evolved such innovative strategies that power everything that we see above ground, but we're not paying attention to them. I mean, it's like science fiction down there. It is crazy down there. And you see it, and you want everybody to see it. You can't make this stuff up when you really start looking at the creatures there. And I just don't want them to disappear.
Another domain that might be interesting to explore a bit is, as I was saying, about the metaphor of the underground, and in Greek mythology, and the Pluto and all this stuff. But do you feel any of that there's this intense responsibility to bring this unseen, not well known, not well understood realm from below ground? How does that feel, psychospiritually? Yeah. I know this is California, so.
Well,
you got to process that. Psychospiritual. Okay, I'm ready for this question.
My Mercury is in Scorpio. And no voice in the deep, stories and messages from the deep. But it is very mythological. And I think we see the story of how life in the oceans has been, over time, more and more discussed. And I think there are analogies there. There's the shallow oceans, and you go down in all these layers until you get to the abyssal oceans, where no light penetrates, where the creatures are so unimaginably strange. And a lot of ocean conservation, and very effective ocean conservation, has worked by helping to reveal the life that lives in these places, to invite us to think about the great below, to invite us to feel a sense of vertigo as we float on the surface of these oceans. And I think we can apply that to soils too. I feel a sense of vertigo when I walk on the ground, like I feel this sense of the depths below me opening up, and it makes me dizzy sometimes. But I really think that's, it's a deeply important thing for us to be aware of and to be working with these mythological dimensions, because a lot of what we're doing is telling stories. And a lot of these stories have mythological armatures and frameworks that, that humans have been telling for a long time, and we can't neglect those.
And thinking about the underground as this frontier of exploration. I mean, we can call ourselves underground astronauts. We want to build a NASA for the underground. There's this sense of unknown. And when people come to, especially when they come to work in the lab in Amsterdam, they leave different people because they've seen things that they haven't seen before. And one of the things, and I think Merlin illustrated this really well in the talk, is that when you're watching these mycorrhizal network, you're seeing things in real time. Like I really want to drive that home. Like those flows, that's not sped up. We're not like, oh, let's put it on. This is in real time. And you're studying behaviors of organisms that don't have brains. And you're still watching how they solve complex problems, like in front of your eyes. We do these, it sounds really cruel. We do these experiments because we have to understand how the networks work, where we cut them. And we see how long it takes for them to heal. And if you make a really clean cut, like a surgeon's cut across the network, they're able to, at first we're like, okay, it'll take a couple of days, maybe the flows will be reinstated. This one network, we came back after lunch, and it had reconfigured, and those flows had just reinstated, and it was like nothing had happened. I mean, the protein, even just biochemically, how that is possible is just mind-blowing. And it really, when you watch another creature, remodeling its body in that way right in front of your eyes, how could you not want to know more? How could we not all be studying this? And I think that for me is sort of the philosophy, is just like you get hooked. These organisms, they change your worldview.
So that brings up the whole issue, and again, language is tricky here, but our mutual friend Jeremy Narby wrote that book, Intelligence in Nature, and he has a whole chapter about the Japanese scientists who took slime molds and that they figured out the fastest way to get to a food source. And this idea that intelligence seems to permeate the biosphere. And when you were showing the slides, I mean, it seemed so even more complex than any AI or, any human informational systems, as mind-boggling as some of those are. So how do you feel about that, this whole concept of for lack of a better word, I know we don't want to anthropomorphize or be hounded out of the scientific establishment, but it really feels to me that we're talking about it seems like decisions are made, you were showing that, the reversal of direction of the, so how does that make you feel? And do you think that the language is up to it, that for the, is the scientific mainstream more accepting of this concept of intelligence permeating the biosphere?
Yeah, a lot have changed in the last few years. So the cognitive sciences evolved, placing the human mind at the center of its studies, and that makes sense because we're humans and we're proud of our brains and what we can do. And sure, let's do that. But then over time that becomes very, very limiting, because you start to use the human mind and human intelligence as a yardstick by which to judge everybody else. And of course, if you do that, then you're going to find that, no, they can't solve this problem that we can solve, and it can become very, very bigoted and very, very limiting. So what's starting to change is that it's, as people have become, partly because people have become much more comfortable attributing intelligence to machines, the whole language and conversation has shifted. And so now the way it's discussed in a growing number of circles in the biological science is that there are intelligent behaviors. These are things like the ability to solve problems or make decisions or adapt to changes in one's environment. And that all organisms to some degree are intelligent problem solvers. It's just they've evolved to solve different kinds of problems. So a fungus has evolved to solve very different kinds of problems to us. And so I think this is not very controversial anymore, which is great. And I think that's really helpful because it invites us into a question that Toby and I love, this question of like, what's it like to be you? When you're studying an organism. This really feels like the central question as a biologist, like, what's it like to be you? And using the you, the second person, like, you're a center of experience. and what's it like to be you? Yeah. And so this really guides both of our conversations about this. And but yeah, thankfully it's not really that fringe anymore.
There was that famous NYU professor who wrote that book about what it's like to be a bat. Remember? Yeah.
Thomas Nagel.
Thomas Nagel. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Toby, what about you?
One of the things that we do in the lab is that we set up these experiments to try to figure out that question, what it's like to be you. And one of the things that these fungi do is they're really good traders, right? Their whole base, their whole way that they live is dependent on getting carbon from plant roots. So they're what we call obligate biotrophs, which means they can't get carbon from anywhere except a root system. And so they have evolved very sophisticated trade strategies to be able to get that carbon. And because we are able to do these really, really high precision experiments, we can set up these types of questions and actually track the way that they move resources to understand how they make decisions. And the strategies they evolve are just mind-blowing. I mean, we can show that they discriminate among different plant roots and send more of the phosphorus to the root system that's giving more carbon in return, that they can discriminate between where they're getting the carbon. They do these things where if you give them a lot of phosphorus, they'll take it up into the network and actually hold back before giving it to the plant until the plant needs it even more, and they get more carbon, right? If they hoard it for just a bit longer, they'll get more carbon in return. We were doing this experiment where we tracked the phosphorus. We attached quantum dots, these nanoparticles, to phosphorus, and they fluoresce in really bright colors when you hit it with a UV source. And we could see that the fungi would take up the phosphorus from a very concentrated area and move it all the way across to another part of the network where the plant demand was higher to be able to get more carbon. And so these are all laboratory experiments, right? So be very careful about taking them to the level of the ecosystem or the forest. But when you bring these systems into the lab and actually study those very precise trading strategies, you see the kinds of problem-solving abilities that they've evolved. And we're just, it feels like very blunt, the questions we ask them. Are you going to trade here or are you going to trade there, Just imagine what they can actually do if we could understand just that level of complexity.
Yeah, because that's a little depressing. It sounds like ruthless capitalism at the underground level, but
It is a bit, though. I mean, it's amazing to see how they move those resources.
Well, striking a good deal. A dear friend, Caroline Casey, I think she spent time at Bioneers. I went to see her in Washington on the way here, and she tells me the story. She's like, Merlin, she's talking about deal making in the living world. And I said, what do you mean by making deals in the living world? She said, well, I had a coyote. She had this pet coyote called Stella. She lived with for many years. And she said, Stella the coyote would make these deals. And they said, like what? And she said, well, I had a friend round, and her shoes went missing. So you're like, okay, Stella's taking the shoes, never mind, like whatever. So they went out, came back, and they'd been making some cookies, and there was this tray of cookie dough on the counter, and they came back, the cookie dough tray was on the ground, licked clean, and there was one shoe next to the tray. So I think this, making deals and this kind of exchange, I don't think that means that we need to say that Stella's a capitalist, I think there's ways to think about deal making and trading and something very ancient and part of life that doesn't need to be about ruthless concentration and extraction of resources.
Yeah, I think that because there was this sort of countervailing force to the neo-Darwinian, nature red in tooth and claw, where people kind of went the other way and nature's all fuzzy and cooperation and symbiosis, and obviously both are true, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Well, we talk about collaboration. Life is collaboration, but collaboration is always a dance between competition and cooperation. You think about life as a family. I think about my life and my family. If you're sitting around a dinner table, there'll be a moment where someone's teasing someone and nagging and competing with them, and then there's some moment where someone does something very generous and cooperative. But all together, we're just a collaborating family who love each other and are doing what we're doing. But it's not just one thing. It would be a great thing. I think about a jazz band on tour. They've been on a tour for 3-4 weeks. They're pissing each other off in the tour bus, but they get on the stand and they play an amazing set. But they get back to griping when they get in the bus. So overall, they're collaborating in this astonishing way, but it doesn't mean that it's just a sort of monotonic. It would be a very boring world, I think, if it was just one or the other.
Yeah.
So another thing that it might be of interest to discuss is, to what extent do you feel that you're carving a new field, that this is a new field of science that's emerging? I know, obviously, as you mentioned, Merlin, that you're standing on the shoulders of people who, but I feel like that, mycology in general and fungal studies are not, are there departments of universities in fungal studies, or is it still the poor child of botany? What is the status of this discipline in the scientific world?
Well, certainly fungi are a kingdom of life that have not had a kingdom's worth of attention. And there are lots of reasons for this. And one of them is that, we thought that they were thought to be plants until the late 60s when they won their independence.
So silly. They're not plants.
In 69. They did. It was 69. And that makes a big difference, because suddenly there are places that you can study fungi that's not in a pathology department. It's not in a yeast genetics department, no part of the genetics department. And it's not in the dusty and unglamorous corner of the botany school either. That we can think of these organisms as they're doing things their own way and requiring a kingdom's worth of attention from us. So I think that would apply to the fungal sciences at large, and thankfully that's starting to change through the astonishing work of so many amazing researchers over so long, and with all the ancestral knowledge that has become part of these bodies of knowledge and understanding. The people have been studying fungi for so long in so many different ways, and everything that's going on today is bringing those together, and so it's just thrilling that there's more oxygen around the subject now.
I think the fungi, they force us to be transdisciplinary. I mean, but really, okay, we're talking about little scientists, right? We all have our very specialized niches. Not when you work with fungi. It's at any given day, we do a lot of work with a brilliant biophysicist, Tom Shimizu, and Tom and I think in such different ways, right? Totally different ways. And the fungi make us ask questions. They demand that we bring our best selves to work every single day, because we don't know what they're doing. I mean, he looks at it and he doesn't know what they're doing. And I'm looking at it from an evolutionary perspective. I don't understand what they're doing. But together we're sort of building and borrowing tools from so many disciplines. I mean, even all the imaging that we're doing, all the videos that you saw, that's all borrowed from the medical industry, right? Of just very different fields. We use quantum dots from different fields. There's all of these different tools that you have to we're getting into using tools from neuroscience, right? All of these different sort of recipes that we have to bring together and try to make a picture of something that none of us on our own could understand. So I think that's what's really cool about studying this field, is you have to be transdisciplinary. You have to bring in so many different ideas.
And obviously there's been a great deal of interest in the sort of more popular culture, with our good friend Paul Stamets and other people so a lot of people who are not scientists or have become interested in there's the whole psychedelic thing we can get into in a minute, but this idea of I think Paul called it the fungal internet, or the planet underground internet. And what do you think about that? I mean, is it risky to get too metaphorical with these kind of pop cultural aspects, and is that a threat to you, or can it be useful in the sense that it elicits popular interest and can help you get funding? What is your relationship to the edges of fungal enthusiasm?
Yeah, well, I mean, metaphors are not an option, right? We use them, we have to use them all the time. Our language is made up of metaphors. Like many of the things, the idioms that we depend on day to day, those were once metaphors, which have been used so much that we forget that they're metaphors. So in doing science, metaphors and analogies are absolutely key, just like they are in any other field of human life and endeavor. And they provide new ways of thinking, and they help provide a kind of framework on which you can arrange concepts and ideas, just like a sculptor might use an armature to provide a support for wet clay. And so I think metaphors is, they're not an option. For me, it's important to have a balanced metaphorical, a balanced narrative diet. So, and to remember that we're using metaphors. So it's when we forget that we're using metaphors that I think we get into trouble. And it's when we become locked into a limited number of metaphors that we might forget that the world is wilder, wetter, and weirder than we can contain.
We can't imagine, to quote our friend Terence.
Yeah, I think he said it great. The only thing that I would add is that, this idea of the internet, right? It's so beautiful in so many senses, and the only thing that sort of rubs me the wrong way, and again, we just have to think of this. Again, from a really fungal point of view, is that like fungi, they're not accessories. They're not accessories to plants, right? And I think that's really important. Like if we flip our worldview, it could be the fungi that are farming the plants above ground. And I think that internet thing just sort of, it makes it a thing. And I guess that's the working with them every day. That's just one way of looking at it, is that you maybe just flip it for a second, And that's what we always have to do with fungi. We're just always like, okay, well, let's flip it. Let's think about it a different way.
Change the frame.
Change the frame, and maybe we can see it slightly differently.
Okay, well, since this is California, I wanted to just venture into the realm of psychedelics, because I know a lot of people who come to Bioneers are very interested in it. But let's take a particular angle on it, which is that it's sort of extraordinary that fungi, which are such ancient creatures by earthly standards, have generated compounds that obviously it wasn't part of their negotiation with humans, because humans weren't around when they first generated these compounds. Is it even useful to speculate as to why these consciousness-altering compounds would have come into existence, or is it just a complete fluke? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think it's very helpful to speculate and to see this as part of a bigger story in the living world, where plants have caffeine and nicotine and opioids, and there are all sorts of parts. The living world is made up of a communicating, intertangled, intermingled web of relations, and many of the communication patterns and pathways of these relationships are chemical. And so many of the ways that chemical communications happens by having an impact on another's physiology. So when a flower is red, or however a bee sees that flower, that's impacting the bee's physiology, and that's to do with chemicals in the flower. So this is part of a much bigger story. And so when some fungi are producing psilocybin, and I think it's quite helpful to think, well, why? And there are ways that this mystery, and people have speculated about this for a long time, but some recent discoveries have made it more of a mystery in quite a fun way. And one of them is that to make psilocybin, it's not just one gene that produces this, the enzymes that make this compound. It's a gene cluster. So there's lots of genes, all need to be there together, operating together to make psilocybin. This gene cluster has moved between different fungal lineages over time by what's called horizontal gene transfer, where a lineage of fungi who have not themselves evolved this gene cluster have acquired it from another lineage of fungi. And what we can learn from this history is that usually when gene clusters move around, they can decay. 3/4 of the genes make it across and the other ones don't. But this gene cluster's remained intact as it jumped between lineages, which would suggest that whatever psilocybin was doing in the life of the fungi that made it, it was adaptive. It was useful to them. There was an evolutionary pressure for it to remain intact. And so then the question is, what was it doing for them? But I think that becomes a more powerful question, because we can now have good reasons to believe that it was doing something for them. So speculation. So 65 million years ago is our best guess now for the first psilocybin-producing mushroom. Insects were around then in a big way, and insects were eating around in the same kind of wood-rotting, dung-living environments that these fungi were peddling the psilocybin in it. And is it to do with taking the insect's mind off their next meal? Befuddling them. Some people say that, it's a deterrent. But then that doesn't go very far, because there are lots of insects that live on psilocybin-producing mushrooms with no apparent problem. Of course, it could be both. It could be that those ones have evolved resistance and now have access to this exclusive food source. Some people say, well, actually, the psilocybin could have been a lure to attract insects to the mushrooms to help them spread spores. But this is the kind of discourse that's going on. And actually one could do some really elegant experiments to see what these mushrooms are doing to insects of different kinds.
Do fungi trip is the,
Yeah.
Just Toby, do you have any thoughts? Is this a domain that interests you?
Yeah, I mean, especially the evolutionary side of it. Evolutionary biology, you just get to ask such questions. Why? And sort of you get to come up with hypotheses and then figure out if there's support or not. But what I really love about these kinds of questions is thinking about strategies, and why fungi do what they do. We were at this event in DC earlier this week, and the first question was like, you all love fungi. Like, why? Why fungi was the question. And it's because they're rebels, right? They do, and I think that gets at this, the question that you asked, like, they're making these compounds. Yeah, what are they doing? That's all I have to say about it. They're rebels.
You said they break all the rules.
Yeah. They break all the rules.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we can open it up for questions, or is there
Great.
any other, burning
Questions?
desire
No,
to
it's
say
fine.
something?
Questions
No?
are great. Yeah.
Okay. So I think that the way it was done in the previous panel was that someone was running around with a
much better like
microphone,
this.
but
Yeah.
but there are enough people here, it might turn into a track meet for whoever is. Well, let's see. Is there anyone here who has a mic out there who can? Yeah, do you want to do it? Okay, so why don't we start nearest where you are? So, yeah.
I had a question about the intuitive process and how that is necessary for making a hypothesis, right? You have some kind of intuition of what's going on. And since we're here in California, I want to expand that a little. You talked about how indigenous people, for example, have known about fungi and their relationships for a long time. And I wonder also if you've ever worked with or thought about working with people who communicate with nature beings. And it's just a more intense type of intuition is how I might describe it. And it just seems like it might be an interesting thing, since there's so much unknown, to just hear it from that perspective, if that's ever occurred.
So what role does intuition play in the scientific process here?
People think that science isn't creative, right? And I think that's probably one of the biggest misunderstandings about science, is there's so much intuition and there's so much creativity. And there are all kinds of ways to increase that intuition. I mean, if I didn't go out into the field and go on these expeditions, my soul would, start to shrivel up. Like, you have to keep that intuition, you have to keep that creativity by just getting filthy, and actually getting out into the ecosystem and exploring it that way. So I would say there's all kinds of ways to get intuition and creativity, and people don't appreciate that enough, I think, in science.
Totally agree. There's a sort of version of being a scientist which is a total myth, which is that scientists are sort of cold-blooded, totally rational, unemotional, dispassionate observers. And that's just not true. Scientists are and have always been whole, intuitive, creative, curious, flawed, wonderful, magical, weird humans trying to make sense of a world that wasn't made to be catalogued or classified, and doing their best. And intuition is such a vital part of science and has always been. And I think, as Toby said, that there are ways to deepen and expand our intuitive faculties, and that might look different for different people. But for me, like Toby, a lot of that has to do with spending time outside in the wild, wet world, feeling confused and feeling connected and feeling part of it.
And the other part of the question was about ancestral knowledge from indigenous people and how that might inform some of your research. Is that something you could?
Yeah. so much of the body of what we call modern scientific knowledge rests on indigenous knowledge that has been imported into the sciences and rebranded as scientific knowledge at some earlier stage. So one way that you can see this is in lots of descriptive knowledge. So when male botanists were writing books about medicinal plants in the 17th century, a lot of the time they learnt about those medicinal plants by going to markets and talking to wise women or herb wives about what they used for what. And then that was kind of laundered of that ancestral property and became part of the body of modern scientific knowledge. So there's lots of places where that's happened and that we might not know about. So I think lots of science rests on that firmament. And I think that's important to bear in mind, even if we can't disentangle every single time that has happened. An interesting case, incidentally, is Albert Hofmann, when he isolated LSD, stumbled on this molecule. But the reason why he was working on these ergot fungi, which are fungi that live inside grains, and they have a history of medicinal use by midwives and herb wives to stop obstetric bleeding, to induce contractions, uterine contractions, a very, very important set of functions. And he was working for Sandoz Labs, and Sandoz Labs had employed him to work on these fungi because of this history as obstetric drugs within folk and indigenous knowledge systems, because they wanted to find new obstetric drugs to bring into the modern pharmaceutical industry, which is why he was doing it. So just that the LSD story, when you follow it back, you come back to a body of ancestral knowledge right there. And so that's often the case. When it comes to fungi today, and in our work, our dear colleague Giuliana Furci, who runs the Fungi Foundation, one of the projects of the Fungi Foundation is a project called the Ancestral Knowledge of Fungi, and they are working with various traditional knowledge holders around the world to learn about traditional uses of fungi and to have these conversations and to try and bring these knowledges together and facilitate these conversations before a lot of this knowledge is lost. And that's really, I think, very powerful and important work.
Yeah.
Hold on, and please think haiku, not Tolstoy, and actually ask the question, So where's the, okay, so there's someone.
Hello, I have a food question. I would like to consult about the devastation of industrial farming in the Midwest. I've been told it would take 50 years to stop and recover from that, and you've just given me this hope that maybe there's something that we can understand about an accelerated remediation. Can you comment on that?
So that question is really to what extent fungal networks could help in remediating soil that's been damaged by monocrops and excessive, fertilizers and pesticides and fungicides.
Yeah, it's a really hopeful story. And that's why we get up every morning to go to work, because there is so much hope. In terms of regenerating soils, fungi are so fundamental to the formation of soil organic matter and healthy soils. And they do recover. I think that it is, again, there's a lot of hope because we can see real case studies of how soil can be regenerated. It's a slow process. And I think that that's what worries us, is that we have to have patience. And sometimes it feels like we just don't have enough time. But the biological processes are there. And I think why the urgency of this work is that there are so many different species, even of mycorrhizal fungi, that do so many different things, but it's that orchestra of them working together that really makes for healthy soil, and we just don't want to lose any of those components. And I think that's what worries us the most, is that to be able to build all of that soil, you need all of these components, and many of them are getting lost. So that's where the urgency comes, but maybe you have.
Yeah, and also just that there are so many amazing groups of humans, often citizen scientist types. Some of them would be like that. Some of them would be ancestral knowledge holders. Some of them will be in all sorts of new and wonderful conglomerations working on composting, for example. all these different ways of composting, different kinds of anaerobic, get this stuff and then mix it with that. And I'm part of a composting nerds chat group. And I don't contribute much, but I just love this. Every day there's some new idea. And I think a lot of these, that soil regeneration can happen faster than we think, provided we stop destroying, we relieve the soil of the destructive forces. Because there's no point trying to undo something if the damage is still being done, right? So I think there's a dance there. But I do think there's reasons to hope that we can regenerate soils much faster than we might have thought a few years ago.
Merlin, by the way, is a passionate fermenter, right, of many things. But yeah, one thing about that, isn't there a risk, because once capitalism and financial flows get involved, in the same way with genetics, that they're looking for the one gene to solve this or that problem, that there's be this frantic search for the fungi that can, you know, get rid of this chemical or that, and people will invest money in that, and they'll lose what you were talking about, which is that holistic idea of the entire system. That seems like a risk given how capitalism operates.
Yeah, but then it does have to bump into the hard reality of the living world, which might well say no. He might, for example, find a strain that might break down a certain type of plastic in certain kinds of conditions, but you can't just then go and throw that strain into some contaminated site and expect it to hustle for itself when, you know, that strain has needs. It might be some sort of pandered little spoiled lab strain, and it doesn't know how to deal with this like rumpus, this confusing site. There are other things so I think there are going to be some hard boundaries that would reject that kind of thinking after a while, and that, you know, ultimately we have to think more in terms of entangled living processes and communities.
Because I know in the bioremediation field, very early on, they were just looking for that 1 or 2 or 3 bacteria that would break this down or that down.
But science is changing. I mean, it is an exciting time to be a scientist, because it is about interactions now, and it is about communities and trying to understand how they work together, and it's a little bit away from, you know, the piles that we used to make, say, oh, this does this, this does that, and it's more about the relationship. So I think that there is some movement towards appreciating that you need these communities of microorganisms to be able to achieve these.
But also, as the questioner indicated, there really is this problem of scale and speed. So, you know, it's hard to, yeah. Anyway, another, here we go. Why not? There we go. Okay.
Thank you for bringing your effervescent joy to us and your work. The lunchtime repair, quantum dot, strange attractors, somebody on the other side already knew and is in communication with this side, or maybe you've heard of morphogenetic field, or option C. Any speculation, is there some higher order already healed that descends and helps the repair? Anybody know?
I think you've just articulated a very ancient mystery that humans have puzzled over and found ways to dance with that question for a very long time. I don't feel like you're going to get any kind of anything approaching a good answer from us. But it comes down to how you understand the nature of reality and the nature of the universe and the nature of consciousness. And there are many ways to deal with these questions. And I won't get into that. But one thing that I think about and feel a lot is the kind of surging, forced will to live, the kind of creative, the wild creative will of the living world. And how powerful this is and how unstoppable. Think about the great extinction events that have happened when unimaginable cataclysms. 98% of all species on the planet become extinct after a winter that lasts for 100 years. Flames raining from the skies, debris clatters down. I mean, what actual total disasters. And life has regenerated and done it again and done it again. And so I think about that, and I think about that wet, wild will that surges into being in every day, in every moment of our lives and all the other lives of the creatures that live on the planet. And for me, that feels like a helpful way to feel the mystery, whatever that might be.
I assume that many of us have heard your dad speak in the past? Merlin. But many of us have heard your dad speak. I'm just confirming that
Sorry, I thought
that
you
is your dad. Rupert is your dad.
He's my dad, yeah.
Yeah. Just wanted to make sure. I'm thinking about We Also Walk Dogs, and the way the dog was connected to the person, and when they decided to come home, the dog went to the front door and waited, and your dad set up that experiment with the fields. And it just seems to me like the mycelia were maybe performing or are performing for us in a way. And I just wonder, I mean, is your dad involved in your work, and how does the M-field stuff relate to your current passion? I'd be interested.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's involved in the sense that he loves to chat about it and tease me about it and probe me with fiendishly difficult questions. And we have a lot of fun. And he tolerates me droning on for hours. So yes, but with regard to his worldview, he's talking about a very, very, very general principles about the nature of reality, the nature of causation and connection, and the pervasive presence of fields that might have ordering influences on matter. So within that, everything is included. So fungi would be living their lives as organisms under those same principles. And so, yeah, I wouldn't... Interesting, the person who coined the term morphogenetic field is a guy called Alexander Gurvich, who coined this term. And he was looking at mushroom growth, mushroom development, and he was interested in how what he called a disordered mass of tousled strands of the mycelium could come into an ordered form of a mushroom. Normally in the living world, order proceeds from order, so that the patterning of our bodies, for example, of any other animal, that's specified at the earliest stage of the embryo. And so order gives rise to further order and so on until you get a fully grown organism. But with this, in the fungal situation, it seemed that this disorder was giving rise to order, and he was deeply confused. And so he invoked this field theory, morphogenetic fields, which then later inspired my father to come up with the morphic resonance and all his other work. But this morphogenetic field concept was actually, it came from a man confused by mushrooms.
Why don't we try someone on the other side just for geographic justice?
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to ask, is there something that we as fungi enthusiasts can do to help further your research or the development of the field?
Join your local mycological society, campaign in your local educational institutions that they should start including fungi, start leaving dead wood around in the garden, more fermentation, brewing, but also there are ways actually that with SPUN.
Yeah. But I agree with all the first ones too. And I can think of even more. I mean, don't leave your soil bare, right? I think that's also super important. I used to work with a farmer, and he would say, "Oh God, I can't see it. I just can't see it when soil is bare. You know, it's like looking at a naked woman. Like, just cover it up. It's so beautiful. Just let me imagine what's below rather than showing me. You know." That had a really big effect on me. I blush when I see soil. You know, it's like. So erotic. But what we're trying to do right now is really power a movement that appreciates underground ecosystems and values underground ecosystems as much as we value above ground ecosystems. And they require different things, you know? Just like Merlin said, leave the deadwood. Like if you were to manage for underground biodiversity, you would change certain, it's just like if you would manage for a particular bird population, right? You would change things to be able to really foster those lives. And we're just trying to understand what it takes to foster those lives. We don't understand the same way. And we don't even know where they are. Like, we don't know where the Amazon of the underground is. And so speaking up for the organisms that we don't see and trying to convince people that there's more to life than what you see, that there's this whole world underground that you don't see, is really what we're fighting for. And then with SPUN, what we do is we're really trying to build a network of people that care about underground ecosystems. And so you can find out a lot about on our website, but one of the things that we're experimenting now, again, with these community-led projects, you know, it's a little bit different because you can't see these mycorrhizal networks. And so it's a lot of DNA sequencing, it's a lot of high precision work. But we're trying to build pipelines so that more people can be collecting soils, because right now it's only 0.001% of the Earth's surface that has been sampled for mycorrhizal fungi. And that's just the surface, right? Now we're starting to go even deeper, and there's like communities that are even deeper, right? And so the scale of what we have to accomplish is enormous. And so, yeah, I think the best thing to do is become an underground astronaut and start caring about what's underground, and help us build a movement where people care about the things that they don't see.
And of course, if you're wealthy and want to donate to SPUN,
Yeah,
I'm sure that you there'd be
Got
no.
that bit, yeah.
Why don't we try someone up front? So there's again, I'm trying to be geographically. Yeah. Well, okay, one more, and then next one will come from the front row. Okay.
I'll be quick. I saw a couple desert fungal biodiversity hotspots on the SPUN site like last year, and I'm just curious.
You said desert, yeah?
Yeah, the
Desert is the future. It's so exciting. There's so much fungal life in deserts. It's really cool, really extraordinary types of fungi. So we just had an expedition where we were working with scientists in the Atacama Desert in Chile. Highest, driest, saltiest soils on Earth, right? It's like going to Mars in the Atacama. And there are these crop oases. There's these oases of plants that are so green and so full of life in a very, what we would consider inhospitable landscape. What fungi are there, and how did they do it, right? I mean, how do they survive these intense, extreme drought conditions? There's a lot going on in deserts that people don't realize. Those plants, they need the fungi even more to survive. There's this new way that scientists are measuring how much water, it's very hard to trace water, but now they figured out a way how much water is going through mycorrhizal networks to plants. And it's incredible. It's incredible how much plants depend on fungi, not just for nutrients, but also water uptake. And we're seeing that most in the deserts. So thank you for bringing up deserts, because it's really exciting to think about that fungal biodiversity. People just haven't looked. People just haven't looked. And so that's what's exciting about that project. In deserts.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for accepting the invitation to Bioneers. Thrilled to see you here. I love the sensitivity, Merlin, with how you answered the question about mapping, and the invitation to understand it deeply, sensitively, ethically. And my question is a simple one. Help us understand the underground world. What is the word for, what is the counterpart to topographical?
You could still say
Topographical.
Yeah, I think you could.
Even
Yeah.
below.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The word top doesn't throw us?
Topos is place. Graphical is like the shape of the place, and you could think about the shape of the place underground as well. But there'll be lots of it. But you might think about this. It's a very different kind of thing, right? You'd have hills and valleys above you and below you. You have all these like totally
Underground
insane.
mountains. There's underground mountains. Who knew, right? I mean, there's a lot happening underground, and we use that word topographical.
But
In a few years, there'll be doctorates in subterranean topography. You know?
But it's more of a labyrinthine topography, perhaps. The surfaces and volumes underground are topographies, but just a whole different order of complexity to what we have above on the surface.
And your film is beautiful. I hope everyone sees it.
Oh, thank you.
Beautiful.
I was going to say one thing about maps before. A good example of colonialism with maps is Amerigo Vespucci, who was a cartographer, and we wound up with the unfortunate name of America as a result of cartographic imperialism. So anyway, yeah.
So even though mycorrhizals are underground, there's spores everywhere in the air. You know, lichens have fungi in it. But I was living up in Mendocino County in an area that had been forested 4 times. You could not grow on that soil. It was hard as rocks. And I was kind of on my high horse because I was going to have to throw my mail out into this truck that is going to, with petroleum, haul it to the trash. So I dumped my mail and my cardboard on top of the soil, covered it with old soil from my gardens, tomato gardens and stuff, and then covered it with straw. And people would go into the forest and try to find mushrooms, but it had been picked dry. Within 4 months, I had 60 morel mushrooms fill an area that's twice the size of that deck. So when you think about inoculating an area, know that the spores are already there, and to create the habitat for it to grow, and let nature or let the divine make the selection on what is going to grow there perfectly to regenerate the environment. And
Excuse me, do you have a question? Because
yes, have you ever just let it and see what happened?
Well, I think a lot of what needs to happen is that. And so, say for example, if you've got a soil system that has a tired and over-exploited arable field that is overplowed and oversprayed, a lot of what you can do is just create the conditions for the creatures that want to come and live there. Like, it's better to let the spores, the mycorrhizal spores that want to be there, regenerate. But you just got to create the conditions for that, and not just creating the conditions for that is just stopping the destruction, right? And once you stop the destruction, then maybe there's some, like you added some stabilizing factors, you know, like the cardboard and the straw. But I think a lot of what needs to happen is precisely as you say.
And that idea, I mean, I think that it is a really good point about, you know, we say, oh, protect the underground, you know, but the spores are everywhere, even the mycorrhizal spores. And so one initiative that we have is to start measuring the biodiversity of mycorrhizal fungi in green roofs, because they actually, these living roofs, they form corridors across cities to help fungi survive.
and pollinators.
And I mean, so many things, yeah. I mean, they're great for lots of things, but I'm talking about the fungi, like I always do. And so these green roofs, they offer a refuge for a really harsh environment. And so now that's what we're doing. We've got this initiative to actually measure mycorrhizal biodiversity, which is supposed to be underground, on some of the tallest buildings on Earth to see what's up there. And they're incredibly diverse. In a city in the Netherlands, in Utrecht, all of the bus stops have green roofs on top of them. And so we're measuring the biodiversity and mapping the city and actually looking at the wind patterns through the city and how that changes what mycorrhizae go where. The other thing I just want to add about mycorrhizae not being only underground is that they're also in the canopy. Like, what? But there's all this soil in the canopy. And again, the fungi are in the air, and then they're growing these networks in the canopy of trees. There's some beautiful research that's just starting to look at the biogeography of underground soil fungi that are on top of trees. So beautiful research.
I'm a gardener and sort of farmer and like to plant things and harvest them. And so I was wondering a couple of things. First, are these networks, do these networks just exist in greater abundance in places where there are lots of plants? But what happens once you remove the plants? I mean, it sounds like they actually exist. This network may exist even if there aren't plants and plant life above ground. So that's sort of my question. And then does it just mean that it's going to be a richer environment if there are plants and trees? And like, what, I mean, maybe I'm even overthinking it, but like, what does a responsible farmer, even on a small scale, do to cultivate that underground life when you're ripping out the overstory? Thank you.
Well, I think it's important to remember, Toby and I are very, very biased towards mycorrhizal fungi. So you might come away with the impression that they're the only important fungi, and that would not be true. There are many ways to be a fungus, and there are many fungi that can live without plants, and many of those fungi live in the soil and do vitally important things in the soil, without which mycorrhizal fungi couldn't do what they do. So even when you take say you are harvesting an annual plant, so you're pulling it all out, and it's, there's still going to be fragments of root with mycorrhizal fungi on there that might be able to pull back into spores to persist until the next growing season, or they might wait till you plant a cover crop, or there'll still be decomposing fungi working there on organic matter in the soil. And so there are lots of ways to think about that. I mean, if you're harvesting a plant and you leave the root system in the ground, then obviously they've still got a root system to live on, and so you might not be so concerned. So I think the answer is it just depends. But in terms of the practices that you might do to look after these fungi, I think you look to the people who are doing agriculture in a way that looks after the soil. You know, the health of the soil. The soil is the habitat for these organisms, and if you're minimal soil disturbance, lots of organic matter, reduce chemical inputs, don't leave it exposed, all this kind of. There are lots of people who do this very, very well, and who are talking about it. Yeah.
So we have time for one more question. So how about this person right here?
Thank you. And as a person that's known your parents for 30 and 40 years, it's really sweet how you are a mixture of them both. In my medical specialty of homeopathic medicine, one of the hot areas of research is in agricultural sciences. And we're finding that homeopathic doses have an effect on crop yield, crop nutrition, and do so without the use of pesticides. And we have assumed that they have an effect upon plants, but I can't help but wonder if actually they're having an effect upon the fungi network. And because phosphorus and silica are two of the medicines that are commonly used in agricultural work. And I just wanted to drop the seed of encourage you to explore what homeopathic doses can have an effect upon soils and upon the different networks.
Well, do the study.
Yeah, well,
but my money would be on the fact that the plant probably wants more than a homeopathic dose of phosphorus, because it's a vital macronutrient that it needs to build the backbone of its DNA, and if it has just a homeopathic dose of a macronutrient, just like if we had any homeopathic dose of a macronutrient, I don't think we'd be able to build the body of this volume to be able to be having this conversation. But I would love to see studies about that, and see studies about the way that these cures might, or these remedies might help plants overcome many of their problems.
Okay, well, we've been asked by the folks producing and running this that because it's the last session, they don't want people crowding the stage to, if there's a reception line for Merlin and Toby. So maybe out there in the hallway, you can stay for a little while and answer a few questions, but eventually they have to go eat and sleep, and so, be respectful. Thank you.